The sound of metal trays hitting wooden tables filled the air in that Texas prisoner of war camp, mixing with the shuffle of worn boots against the cold concrete. It was late in 1943, somewhere in the heart of Texas, where the mornings still carried a chill before the sun burned it away. Inside the mess hall, the smell of cooking hung thick, that particular scent of flour meeting hot metal griddles, of butter melting, of something sweet being prepared in quantities that seemed almost wasteful. The German prisoners filed in like they did every morning, moving in formation even though the war for them was over, at least the fighting part. These weren't just any soldiers either. Some had fought across the scorching sands of North Africa, veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps who had seen things that aged men beyond their years. Others were younger, barely past boyhood really, captured in the Italian campaign before they'd even had a chance to prove themselves in the way they'd been trained to believe mattered. They moved stiffly, holding on to whatever discipline they could maintain, because discipline was all they had left of the world they'd known. When the first serving of breakfast arrived at their tables, something unexpected happened. The American kitchen staff set down plates in front of these prisoners, and on those plates sat stacks of pancakes, soft and golden, still steaming in the cool air of the hall. The syrup had been drizzled over them already, that amber liquid catching what light came through the high windows. For a moment there was just silence as the Germans looked down at their plates. Then the laughter started, rolling through the hall like a wave-building strength. Men pointed at the food, elbowing their neighbours, their voices rising in mockery that carried an edge of scorn. One prisoner, his English broken but clear enough, shouted across the table that this was breakfast for children, not for soldiers. Another muttered to the man beside him, asking if perhaps America fought its wars with toys on their plates as well as in their hands. The laughter grew louder, more confident, tinged with bitterness and something that might have been the last scraps of pride they could still claim. The contrast with what these men knew as proper food couldn't have been more stark. They'd grown up with Schwarzbrot, that dense black bread heavy with rye that required real effort to chew, bread that sat in your stomach like a promise of endurance. Those soft, fluffy cakes seemed ridiculous to men raised on such fare. A few of them banged their fists on the tables, turning the moment into theatre, performing their disdain for each other as much as for the guards watching from the edges of the room. One man stood up slightly, his voice dripping with theatrical sarcasm, as he announced to the hall that they should all behold the mighty American feast, these cakes fit for soldiers of the great United States. The other prisoners roared their approval of his mockery, the sound bouncing off the walls. The American guards stood near the walls, watching this display with expressions that gave nothing away. They didn't intervene, didn't tell the prisoners to quiet down or show respect. They just stood there, waiting, perhaps understanding what was about to unfold in a way the Germans couldn't yet see. The hall crackled with an energy that felt almost electric, these captured men savouring what felt like a small victory, a chance to look down on their captors even from behind barbed wire. Their uniforms were in terrible condition, worn threadbare in places, patched in others. Their boots had holes, some of them, the leather cracked from hard use and little maintenance, but their sense of superiority, their conviction that their culture stood above this American softness, remained intact. They'd come from a Europe that was burning, where cities were being reduced to rubble night after night, where families went hungry more often than not, where every commodity had become precious and rare. Yet here they stood in this Texas camp, sneering at abundance, too caught up in their own contempt to recognize the irony of their situation. You could see it in their faces if you looked closely enough. Some were sneering openly, lips curled in disgust. Others smirked, sharing jokes with their neighbors about American weakness. A few even doubled over with exaggerated laughter, making a show of how absurd they found the whole thing. One prisoner wiped at his eyes as if tears of mirth were streaming down his face, as if the very existence of Pancakes was the funniest thing he'd encountered since being captured and shipped across the Atlantic to this strange land. But the laughter wasn't really about the food, not entirely. It was about holding on to something, some piece of identity in a world where everything familiar had been stripped away. It was about mocking an enemy they could no longer meet on any battlefield, about finding some way to feel superior when superiority was the only thing left that couldn't be taken by force. The first act of this strange drama began not with hunger or need, but with ridicule echoing through a mess hall, with men laughing at what their captors offered them, never imagining that within moments their laughter would die in their throats, replaced first by stunned silence and then by something far more primitive and honest. The laughter that filled the hall had layers to it, but underneath everything was pride, a pride that ran bone deep. For these German soldiers, bread wasn't just something you ate to fill your stomach. It was woven into identity itself, into their understanding of strength and discipline and what it meant to be a proper man. They'd been raised on Schwarzbrot, that black bread so dense and heavy it could sustain a labourer through a full day of back-breaking work. Its very weight was meant to communicate something, to promise endurance and substance. In the Africa Corps, men had carried chunks of this bread into battle, gnawing on it between firefights, letting it sit heavy in their bellies while they fought under the merciless North African sun. To them, this was what soldiers ate. This was proof of resilience, evidence of a willpower forged through hardship and discipline. Among the prisoners sat an officer, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Richter, a man whose uniform showed the signs of hard campaigning. The fabric was frayed in places, worn thin at the elbows and knees. If you looked carefully, you could still see traces of desert sand worked into the seams, remnants of a war fought in a climate that seemed designed to destroy both men and materials. Despite the shabby state of his uniform, Richter's voice still carried authority when he spoke. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face as he slapped his palm against the table hard enough to make the plates rattle. He declared loudly enough for several tables to hear that they ate to fight, not to play games. The men around him nodded their agreement, some muttering their own additions to his statement. In Richter's worldview, in the understanding shared by many of his fellow prisoners, these pancakes represented everything wrong with America. They were sweet where food should be hearty, soft where it should be substantial, almost feminine in their delicacy. A real soldier needed food that weighed in the stomach, that demanded effort to chew, that promised the kind of endurance required for long marches and longer battles. Back in their barracks during the long hours of captivity, many of these prisoners had conversations that circled back to the same themes again and again. They would contrast whatever they were given to eat with their beloved Brotzeit, that traditional German meal of bread and sausage and pickles that represented home and normalcy. One guard who spoke some German later recalled overhearing a prisoner boasting to his fellows that German soldiers could march for days on end, fueled by nothing more than rye bread and schnapps, while Americans seemed satisfied with what looked like children's birthday treats. The pride in that statement, the absolute conviction behind it, filled the air of the camp like an invisible presence. It was a psychological wall these men had built around themselves, a final defense against the humiliation that came with defeat and captivity. But that pride, as it hung in the air of the mess hall that morning, was also threaded through with denial in ways the prisoners themselves couldn't quite see. These men didn't yet understand that back in their homeland things were cracking apart under the weight of shortages and deprivation. By 1943, German families in cities like Hamburg and Essen were standing in ration lines for hours, sometimes in the cold and rain, often to receive nothing more than ersatz coffee brewed from roasted grain and bread that had been stretched with sawdust or potato flour to make the limited wheat supplies go further. Children were growing up knowing constant hunger as their normal state. Mothers traded family heirlooms for a handful of butter or a few eggs. Meanwhile, these prisoners in their Texas camp scoffed at pancakes as symbols of American weakness and softness, even as their own wives and children struggled to find enough to eat to get through another day. There's a particular cruelty to the irony in all of this. By clinging so tightly to the supposed toughness and superiority of their own bread, by holding it up as evidence of their cultural strength, These prisoners were only making the contrast sharper with what was about to happen. One corporal, who couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, boasted loudly to his table mates about how their black bread had real weight to it, how it made men out of boys. He tore into his own memory, describing mornings back in Bavaria where his mother would lay out thick slices of rye bread with sausage as thick as a man's wrist, the fat still glistening on it. His fellow prisoners grinned at the description, nodding along, some even laughing at the memory of abundance that now seemed to belong to another world entirely. The pancake, by comparison, looked like nothing at all to them, just soft golden air arranged on a plate, barely worth the effort of eating. It was precisely this pride, this elevation of their own soldiers' bread into something almost sacred, that set the stage for what would come next. Their laughter, their boasting, all the chest-thumping about German superiority and endurance would crumble away the moment their teeth actually sank into something they hadn't expected. The hall had quieted just slightly as more trays clattered onto tables, as knives scraped against plates, as the actual moment of eating drew closer. Somewhere in that pause between mockery and consumption, the line between pride and revelation grew thinner and thinner, stretched almost to breaking. Soon, with nothing more dramatic than a single bite of food, that line would snap completely and vanish. The first actual bite came almost like a dare someone had accepted. A young corporal named Dieter Hoffmann, who was only 21 years old, smirked as he lifted a forkful of pancake toward his mouth. The men around him had egged him on, calling out suggestions about how children eat, making a game of it. Hoffmann laughed, rolling his eyes in an exaggerated display, as if preparing to endure some kind of joke at his own expense. But then the warm, buttery cake touched his tongue, and something changed in his expression. The smirk faltered and slipped away. He chewed once, slowly, then again with more attention. Then he swallowed, faster than someone might have expected, with a speed that betrayed surprise. The men watching him leaned forward with curiosity, a sergeant raising his eyebrows as he waited for Hoffmann to deliver the punchline to whatever joke this was supposed to be. Instead, Hoffmann dropped his fork, grabbed it again almost immediately, and shoved another large bite into his mouth. His face had transformed completely. No more mockery, no more laughter, just raw urgency and an appetite he clearly hadn't anticipated. The transformation spread through the hall like a contagion. Men whose cheeks had grown gaunt from months of limited rations, from the stress of combat and capture and uncertainty, closed their eyes as they chewed, savouring the food in a way that seemed almost spiritual. Another prisoner who had laughed so hard earlier that actual tears had streamed down his face now shoveled pancakes into his mouth, as if afraid the food might disappear if he didn't eat it immediately. The careful discipline these men prided themselves on dissolved under the simple reality of sweet, warm food hitting empty stomachs. A diary that was later found in the camp records, pages yellowed and edges worn, contained a brief entry from this very morning. The writer, whose name was never recorded, had written that he hadn't expected it to be like this, sweet and warm and unlike anything he'd tasted in Germany. He'd laughed at first, he admitted, but then he'd eaten, and then all he'd wanted was more. That anonymous confession captured something that so many of the prisoners felt but couldn't or wouldn't admit aloud. It documented the collapse of arrogance when confronted with something as humble and ordinary as breakfast. The moment played out almost in slow motion if you were watching carefully. Hands gripped forks tighter, knuckles going white. Cheeks bulged with hurried bites, barely chewed before more food was added. The silence spread through the hall like a tide coming in, inexorable and complete. What had begun as derision and mockery transformed into hunger, then into desire, then into something close to desperation. The laughter had evaporated entirely now, replaced by nothing but the clatter of metal utensils on plates being scraped clean, every last smear of syrup wiped up and consumed. That first bite had done more than silence their jeers. It had stripped away the protective layers of pride they'd wrapped around themselves, left them vulnerable and exposed in a way that had nothing to do with military defeat and everything to do with simple human need. The stage was set now for something even more startling than silence, for a desperation that would reveal just how thin the veneer of superiority really was. What had started as curiosity, as a dare taken up and an expectation confounded, quickly unravelled into something that looked uncomfortably like chaos. The first trays had been cleared completely, scraped so clean they practically shone. The syrup bottles that had been set out on the tables were nearly empty, tipped upside down as prisoners squeezed out every last drop. Yet somehow the hunger only seemed to deepen rather than satisfy itself. Men who had been mocking and sneering just minutes before now scraped at their plates with the edges of their forks, trying to capture crumbs and fragments they might have missed. The quiet that had fallen over the hall during those first astonished bites gave way to a different kind of noise entirely. Voices began rising, some demanding, others pleading. Hands reached out toward the serving line. Trays slammed down on tables as men finished and immediately wanted more. In the far corner of the hall, a prisoner stood up from his bench, waving his tin plate toward the American kitchen staff like a flag of surrender. His voice cracked as he called out, half demand and half desperate plea, for more food. A guard standing nearby raised one eyebrow at the display but didn't say anything immediately, just signalled back toward the kitchen with a small gesture of his hand. Another prisoner leapt up behind the first, shoving his own plate forward, adding his voice to the request. Within moments, a line had formed, ragged and impatient, men pressing shoulder to shoulder as if these pancakes were rations of survival rather than the objects of ridicule they'd been just a short time ago. Arguments broke out at the tables over scraps and portions. One soldier accused another of stealing an extra piece, his voice rising in genuine anger over something that would have seemed trivial an hour earlier. Fists clenched on the tabletop, voices hissed through gritted teeth in harsh German that needed no translation to convey frustration and accusation. A sergeant who'd been trying to maintain some semblance of order barked out a command for calm, but even he glanced down at his own plate with something that looked like shame at how quickly he'd cleaned it. Two men nearly came to actual blows over the last golden wedge of pancake left on a shared platter between their places. They were grappling for it, hands locked around the plate, before a guard stepped in and separated them with a shake of his head and the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A fragment from a letter written by one of the camp prisoners, later recovered from the archives, captures the atmosphere perfectly. The writer described how they had laughed at these pancakes initially, seeing them as another sign of American foolishness. But then they'd fought over them, he admitted. He'd watched comrades he'd trusted in battle, men whose lives he'd held in his hands and who'd held his in return, pushing each other and arguing for another taste of this breakfast they'd mocked. It was shameful, he wrote, but it was also utterly real. Whether it was simple hunger or something deeper, he couldn't quite say. The kitchen staff, mostly young American privates who'd been assigned to the monotonous duty of feeding prisoners day after day, exchanged knowing glances as they watched the scene unfold. One of them, a farm boy from somewhere in Iowa whose face still carried the softness of youth, muttered to his companion that he guessed the Germans liked the pancakes after all. The irony of the whole situation was almost too perfect. These were men who had marched under the swastika, soldiers who'd been taught and who'd believed in the absolute superiority of their culture and their people. Now they were reduced to clamouring and fighting and begging for second helpings of American pancakes, soft, sweet cakes they'd declared unfit for soldiers. The mess hall swelled with tension and a kind of frantic urgency. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor mixed with trays being thrust forward toward the serving line. Boots stomped against concrete as men jostled for position. It created a rhythm that had nothing to do with mockery anymore, only with desperate appetite. The reversal was total and complete. They'd entered this hall laughing and superior. They remained now as beggars, stripped of pretense by nothing more than good food generously given. The most ordinary of American foods had pulled composure and pride away from them like a magician pulling a tablecloth from beneath dishes, revealing the simple human beings beneath all the uniforms and ideology. For the first time since these men had been herded into this camp, the balance of power in the hall didn't tilt toward guns or guard towers or military discipline. It tilted toward something far simpler and more fundamental, toward whoever controlled access to the next plate of pancakes coming out of that kitchen. Behind every golden pancake that got served in that Texas mess hall, behind every pat of butter and every drizzle of maple syrup, lay a truth that was larger than the camp itself, larger even than any individual prisoner's experience. It was the truth of American abundance during those war years, a staggering capacity for production that seemed almost unimaginable to these European soldiers. Each plate that was set down carried not just flour and butter and eggs and syrup, but also an implicit message. It announced that the United States was a nation that could fight simultaneous wars on multiple continents, could build ships and planes and tanks by the thousands, and still feed not only its own population but its soldiers abroad and even its captured enemies. Every bite carried that weight of meaning whether the prisoners recognized it consciously or not. By 1943, American farms had harvested nearly 1.2 billion bushels of wheat in a single year. The number was so vast it almost lost meaning, dwarfing the combined yields of several European nations added together. Trainloads of grain rolled out of Kansas and Nebraska in seemingly endless succession. Flour mills in cities across the Midwest thundered day and night, grinding grain into flour at a pace that never slackened. Dairy farms in Wisconsin and Vermont poured what seemed like rivers of milk into both civilian and military supply chains. From maple groves in New England to cornfields stretching to the horizon in Iowa, the American food system seemed not just robust, but genuinely inexhaustible. This was the foundation that allowed pancakes dripping with sweetness to be served not only to citizens eating breakfast at home, but to the very men who had tried, not so long ago, to destroy that abundance. The prisoners sitting in that hall knew the reality of scarcity in ways that most Americans couldn't truly understand. Letters that had been smuggled out of Germany, missives that somehow made it past censors and across battle lines, told stories of children in Hamburg scouring alleyways for potato peels, of mothers trading precious wedding rings for just a handful of butter, of families huddled in cellars while bombs fell, emerging to find that even if their homes still stood, there was nothing to eat. These men remembered bitter mornings in barracks back in Europe, sipping ersatz coffee that had been brewed from roasted barley or even acorns, a pale shadow of the real thing that did nothing to warm or satisfy. To sit now in this American camp with plates made sticky by syrup, surrounded by the rich smell of warm batter cooking on griddles, represented a humiliation that cut deeper than any defeat on a battlefield possibly could. At one table, a soldier whispered something, almost to himself, his voice barely carrying to the men on either side of him. In Essen, he said, his daughter waited in line all day for bread, standing in the cold with other hungry children and exhausted mothers, hoping that when she finally reached the front of the line, there would still be something left to buy with their ration cards. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, though he caught himself quickly and hid the emotion behind another hurried bite of pancake. His comrades heard him, their eyes flicking toward him and then away, but nobody said anything. Pride demanded that silence, required that they not acknowledge the crack in the facade. But the pancakes sitting on their plates mocked that silence more effectively than any propaganda leaflet dropped from a plane ever could have. The guards watching this scene understood the symbolism even if they didn't articulate it in so many words. They stood along the walls and near the doorways, watching these German prisoners devour breakfast with an appetite that bordered on desperation, knowing that each forkful carried its own message about American power. It wasn't the power of bombs or bullets this time, but the power of abundance, the ability to be generous because there was no fear of collapse or scarcity. One of the cooks, a black man from Louisiana who'd been assigned to kitchen duty, stood at his griddle ladling batter and flipping pancakes with practiced efficiency. At one point he caught the eye of a German officer across the room. The officer froze mid-motion, struck by something in the encounter. In Germany, under the regime these men had served, this cook would have been considered subhuman, would have been invisible at best, or actively despised and targeted at worst. Yet here he stood in this American camp, feeding his nation's captured enemies, doing so with authority and dignity and strength. It was a silent lesson about power and about a society that was far more complex than the simplistic caricature that had been painted by the regime's propaganda machinery. The pancake had become something more than just food on a plate. It was proof, immediate and undeniable, of American plenty and capacity. It told every prisoner sitting in that hall, whether they wanted to hear the message or not, that this was a country so fundamentally rich in resources that it could afford to feed its enemies with sweetness and abundance while their own homeland couldn't even adequately feed its children. The irony cut sharper than any blade could have, leaving these men shaken in ways that bombs and bullets had never quite managed to accomplish. The food sat in their stomachs, warm and sweet, and with it sat the uncomfortable recognition that everything they'd been taught about American weakness might have been a lie. Something unexpected began to emerge as the hunger quieted and bellies filled. Underneath the desperation and the arguments over portions, something else stirred, fragile and tentative. For the first time since their capture and transport to this Texas camp, the German prisoners found themselves sharing something that felt almost human with their American guards. It was just breakfast, simple food eaten together, but in that act there was a thread of connection that hadn't existed before. The pancakes, golden and sweet and generous, had stripped away the layers of mockery and pride and military posturing, leaving behind just men at tables, eating together in an uneasy but genuine silence. One of the American privates, a lanky farm boy from somewhere in Ohio whose hands showed the calluses of agricultural work, noticed a prisoner staring at the syrup bottle he held. The German's eyes were fixed on it with an intensity that suggested the bottle contained something far more precious than sweetened tree sap. With a slight shrug, the American slid it across the table toward the prisoner without a word. The German froze completely, uncertain whether this was some kind of trick or test, his hand hovering in the air. But when the guard gave him a small nod of encouragement, he reached out carefully and took the bottle, pouring a thick amber stream over what remained of his pancakes. Around them, other prisoners who'd noticed the exchange let out soft laughter, not bitter this time, but almost embarrassed, self-conscious. For just a moment, the war seemed to pause, to step back and allow simple human interaction to fill the space it usually occupied. In another corner of the mess hall, Samuel Brooks, one of the black kitchen workers, carried in a fresh tray of pancakes, steam still rising from them. A German lieutenant who sat at the nearest table had, only days before, been heard boasting about racial superiority in conversations with his fellow officers. Now he found himself completely unable to meet Brooks's eyes as the tray was set down within his reach. Here was a man he'd been taught to despise, whose very humanity had been denied by the ideology he'd served, and yet it was Brooks who was providing the food that had silenced their laughter and exposed their hunger. History records no words exchanged between them in that moment, but the silence itself carried tremendous weight. It was a mirror being held up to propaganda, showing the reflection to be false and twisted beyond recognition. That morning, gossip spread through the prisoner barracks like wildfire jumping from tree to tree. Men whispered to each other that the guards had slipped them extra portions on purpose, that the Americans had actually chuckled watching Germans lick their plates clean, that there was a strange kind of humour in it, but not the cruel kind they might have expected. One fragment from a diary later recovered reads simply, "Strange how quickly enemies can laugh together. They gave us syrup twice. We smiled for a few minutes, and the war seemed very far away." The words captured something essential about what had happened in that hall, a temporary suspension of hostilities over nothing more significant than breakfast. Then came the arguments again, but this time they weren't directed at the guards or the American kitchen staff. The prisoners turned on each other over questions that cut to the heart of their beliefs. Some insisted loudly that it was all manipulation, an American psychological trick designed to soften their spirits and make them more compliant. They warned their fellows not to be seduced by good treatment, to remember who they were and what they stood for. Others, their mouths still sticky with residual sugar, asked the forbidden question aloud where everyone could hear it. If this is how they treat us as captives, as enemy soldiers they have every right to hate, how do they treat their own people? The question struck nerves throughout the barracks. Ideological walls that had stood firm for years, reinforced by propaganda and repetition and the pressure of conformity, began to show cracks under nothing more than the weight of pancakes and maple syrup. The mess hall had transformed into a place of paradox that morning. On one hand, these were still sworn enemies of the United States, captured fighters who remained loyal, at least outwardly, to the regime that had sent them to war. On the other hand, they'd just accepted kindness from those same enemies, generosity they hadn't earned or deserved. And worse still, from the perspective of their ideology, they'd enjoyed it thoroughly. They'd wanted more. They'd fought each other for seconds. It's here that the story stops being simply about food and becomes something more fundamental, about the collapse of certainty and the disintegration of absolutes. Imagine being in that room yourself, sitting at one of those tables with a uniform that marked you as the enemy. Would you have laughed at the pancakes when they first arrived? Would you have refused them out of pride, pushing the plate away to prove a point? Or would you have taken a second, helping even knowing it meant betraying, if only in small ways, the beliefs you'd carried with you into war? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're worth considering. The war would continue grinding on outside the barbed wire fences of the camp. Battles would be fought, cities would burn, lives would be lost by the millions before it finally ended. But for many of the men inside that Texas camp, the memory of pancakes would linger in strange and unexpected ways. It would last longer in their minds than many actual battles they'd fought, proving more memorable than the sound of artillery or the sight of tanks rolling across desert sand. Months passed in captivity, stretching into years for some. The routines hardened into familiar rhythms, work details and roll calls and endless hours behind wire. Yet the small details, the human moments, those etched themselves deepest into memory. Not the guards' rifles or the searchlights cutting through darkness at night, but that particular morning when pride dissolved into hunger and laughter gave way to stunned silence over nothing more than golden cakes on a plate. Years later, when these men finally returned to a Germany that had been shattered almost beyond recognition, many of them carried that memory quietly, like a scar hidden beneath clothing. The Germany they came home to was a landscape of bombed-out cities where rubble-filled streets and buildings stood as hollow shells. Ration cards still governed every meal. Families had hollow-eyed looks that came from years of privation. Yet some of these former prisoners whispered to their wives about the American breakfast, speaking of it in tones that mixed wonder and confusion. One former prisoner, writing in 1952, years after the war had ended, admitted in a letter that he remembered the pancakes more vividly than any bread he'd eaten at home. They'd been sweet and warm and absurd in their abundance, he wrote. He'd dreamed of them sometimes, which seemed ridiculous even to him. Such recollections found their way into memoirs that were published decades after the events. They appeared in letters that were never meant for publication, tucked away in desk drawers and discovered by children or grandchildren going through old papers. They surfaced in late-night conversations in taverns where old soldiers gathered, confessions made over beer that the enemy had fed them better than their own country had ever been able to manage. For some of these men, the pancakes became a symbol of fundamental dissonance that they struggled to reconcile. How could a nation powerful enough to drop bombs that reduced Hamburg to rubble, that could rain destruction from the sky night after night, also afford to waste flour and butter on feeding prisoners of war? How could men they'd been taught their entire lives to hate prove capable of laughing so easily, of ladling syrup so generously, of sharing abundance so freely without demanding anything in return? These questions burrowed deep into consciousness, unsettling the certainties that propaganda had built up over years of repetition. There's an anecdote that was told decades after the war by a former Afrika Korps sergeant. He was sitting in a cafe somewhere in Bavaria, watching his young grandson eat a piece of cake. The child asked him about the war, as children do, wanting to hear stories of adventure and heroism. The old sergeant thought for a long moment, then told the boy not about battles or bravery, but about pancakes in a Texas prison camp. He described the sweetness, the warmth, the way they'd laughed and then fallen silent and then fought each other for more. The child stared up at him in wonder, not yet able to grasp how something so simple and ordinary could undo years of belief and training. The image lingered in the story, that slow pour of syrup catching light, glistening in sunlight streaming through mess hall windows, becoming a symbol of a moment when certainty cracked and fell away. History teaches us that wars are measured in grand terms, in territory gained and lost, in casualties counted and resources expended, in political outcomes and social transformations. The big moments get recorded, the major battles and crucial decisions that changed the course of events. Yet sometimes the truest measure of what war does to human beings lies not in those grand clashes of armies, but in the smallest of moments, the quiet instances that live in personal memory long after the sound of gunfire has faded into history books and monuments. For thousands of German prisoners who were held in camps across the United States during those war years, that defining moment came not on any battlefield, not in the instant of capture or surrender, but at a breakfast table in Texas. It came when laughter over pancakes turned into silence, then into hunger, then into a kind of reflection that changed how they understood the world. The irony is almost too perfect to be believed. These men had marched under banners of hatred, had absorbed propaganda about their own superiority, had been hardened by rhetoric about sacrifice and struggle and the necessity of their cause. They'd seen themselves as warriors in an existential conflict. And yet what disarmed them most completely was not the barrel of a rifle pointed at them, not the superior firepower of American forces, but the softness of food they'd initially mocked. A simple pancake, golden and warm and dripping with syrup, revealed to them a truth that no speech or argument could have conveyed. It showed them that America's strength rested not only in weapons and machines and industrial capacity, but in the fundamental ability to feed even its enemies with a generosity that seemed almost careless in its abundance. Decades after these events, some of those men would still speak about that taste when prompted by the right question or memory. They carried it as a symbol of contradiction, of the moment when the world proved itself wider and more complex than the narrow cage of ideology they'd been trapped within. For them, the pancake became proof that abundance could shock as deeply as violence, that kindness could pierce through psychological armor more effectively than bullets ever pierced physical armor. It demonstrated that generosity, when unexpected and unearned, could shake foundations more thoroughly than force. There's something profoundly human in this particular memory surviving and being passed down. The war was cruel in ways almost impossible to fully comprehend, merciless in its destruction, unforgiving in its demands. Yet within even its darkest chapters, fragments of compassion and basic human decency managed to survive and even flourish in small ways. A guard sliding a syrup bottle across a table to an enemy who tried to kill his countrymen. A prisoner stunned into humility by nothing more than sweetness on his tongue. These tiny details remind us that history consists not only of destruction and violence, but also of resilience and dignity and fleeting moments of genuine connection between human beings who might otherwise have had every reason to hate each other. Perhaps that's the real reason why this particular story endured when so many others faded away. It spoke not just about food or about the material conditions of prison camps or even about the particular dynamics of World War II. It spoke about the fundamental possibility of seeing your enemy as human, even if only for the length of a shared meal. It suggested that beneath all the uniforms and ideologies and national identities, people remain people, capable of being moved by simple acts of kindness, vulnerable to the power of generosity, able to recognize humanity in those they've been taught to consider less than human. The pancakes in that Texas mess hall became more than breakfast. They became a small instance of hope, a reminder that even in the midst of humanity's worst impulses toward violence and hatred, there remain possibilities for connection and understanding, and the recognition that we might have more in common than the forces dividing us would have us believe.